warmly welcome you all. I would like to welcome you all to the Friday webinar series of EGROW on the series of 100 webinars, getting the best minds on contemporary issues from across the world. It is in that very context that in our country, we are taking a review of inflation targeting. And the Reserve Bank of India has recently come out with a discussion paper on the monetary policy framework. Today's book, The Unexpected Revolutionaries, as you can see on your screen, is about central banking. And obviously, when we speak about central banking, we have to be speaking about inflation targeting. So we have invited Professor Manuela Moschella to come and speak to us on this book. She covers a spectrum of issues, but most importantly, she covers the Volcker period of inflation, and the economics profession feel that they have conquered inflation. She speaks about that in her book. Issues. And the other where wondering, was it unexpected? Why not reluctant revolutionaries? Because the central banks are not revolutionary, generally very conservative, and they're expected to be very conservative. If you read the literature from Canada at Harvard, they'll tell you that the major ingredient has to be conservative. Will carry the whole burden of the economy. It's not a simple. I've been a central banker myself, and I know these are central bank has to balance many things. It has to balance, though it's political, refer to it in our book very extensively. The central bank is expected to be a political above politics, not worried about the ideology of the current regime, but can it, or sooner or later it has to succumb to it when the pressure comes. After Lehman Brothers, the pressure was not from Lehman Brothers. Probably they had to take support of the government. Many things changed. And in her book, she mentions about it. So I think there is a sort of a relationship between the government and the central bank, and it has to be reasonably accommodative. And certainly, the government is the big brother, the daddy, and the central bank has to be, to that extent, listening to the big. In her book. And it was that, well, there was central banks are independent, and all that started in the 90s, as she explains so well in her book. But then how much of independence can you really exercise when something like therefore the central bank have to take care of the political affiliations, the ideology of the ruling party. It has to take care of the economy because it's the banking system. And it has to take care of the too, because all its decisions, especially the interest rate is very futuristic. And every loan that you take, you bind the future generation in it. So I think it's a very timely book. And because of inflation targeting, very useful for us at this very juncture. Let me briefly introduce to you the professor, the author of the book. She's a professor of political science in the Department of Political Analysis at University of Bologna, where she also serves as director of the research center Connect, Transnational Connections and Governance. She's an adjunct professor at one of the editors of the Review of International Political Economy. She has served as Associate Fellow at the Europe Program at Chatham House and a Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Her research focuses around the political dynamics of economic policymaking, the evolving interplay between technocratic governance and democratic accountability, and the transformation economy. The latest book, titled Unexpected Revolutionaries: How Central Banks Made and Unmade Economic Orthodoxy, was published in 2024 by the Cornell University Press. She is also one of the co-editors of European Political Economy, Theoretical Approaches, and the Policy Issues. So she is very well versed with the political economy of the central banks, but I would say in the book, she looks and sounds like an economic historian, and that makes the book even richer. With that, let me hand over to the professor to talk about her book and tell us for about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Professor, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sharon, for this extremely kind invite and for the very kind words of introduction. I'm super happy to be here with you today and to have the chance to discuss my book. I'm also very happy to be here in a foundation that has economic growth on its title and on its mission, because I really cannot think of a more important mission these days. So Sharon has already anticipated something that I really care very much about, the title of my book, Unexpected Revolutionaries, because Sharon, as was saying, usually when we think about central banks, unexpected revolutionaries are not exactly the first words that comes to mind. Sharon was reminding us about Rogoff and the idea that a central banker should be conservative. And, this is exactly in contradiction with the title of my book. And so let me walk you through, what have been really my motivations behind this manuscript and why did I title it Unexpected Revolutionary. As you can see from this first slide, what I'm interested in the book, it has been the puzzling transformation that has occurred in central banks and central banking. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what I mean about this puzzling transformation, but really by anticipating, and Sharan has already done it in his kind introduction, I basically tell a story of how central banks and the world of monetary policy and central banking have transformed since after the Volcker shock of the 1980s and the fight against inflation in the 1980s, till basically the period that started with 2008 and then 2020. So with the global financial crisis and then later with the COVID crisis. So I will get back to this transformation in a second to tell you exactly how I try to reflect on this change. I also want to say at the outset that the way I like to think about the manuscript that I wrote is that this is not just a central bank story, but is much more broadly a transformation in the macroeconomic regime, right? In the way we all think about how capitalist economies are organized since at least the 1990s, because the control of inflation and the role of central banks in capitalist economy has really been the linchpin of capitalist system since at least the 1990s. So this book, of course, focuses on central banks, but central banks are really the entry point to think and reflect on the macroeconomic regime that characterize, most capitalist economies since at least the 1990s. Another broad theme that cut through the book, and I will probably, bring to the surface, and I'm happy to discuss more also in our question and answer, is the relationship between economic power and democracy, okay? Because central banks are, of course, independent economic authorities that exercise huge economic power. And since they are unelected and they are independent, This, of course, raises huge democracy questions. Okay, the classic question: who elected the bankers? And what kind of accountability they have. And lastly, another major topic that I discuss in the book, of course, as I'm going to tell you in a second, this book is mostly about the United States and Europe, or at least, I focus in order to make my arguments on the Europe response and the United States response to the 2008 and the 2020 crisis. And so it tells us something also about the differences between these two domestic political economies. So it's a book about central banks, but it's a central banks are really used to get at a bigger story about what is the macroeconomic regimes of the past 4 decades at least. I also want to say why this book now, before getting into the details about the manuscript. I think that we have all heard about this guy, his name is Donald Trump. It's the current president of the United States. And he's once made, central banks extremely fashionable or attractive on a lot of important respects, because he has, since he has taken office, he has not shied away from putting pressure on central banks, especially on the Fed, so the US central bank. And so you might know that Donald Trump has repeatedly attacked the US Fed for not doing enough in sustaining economic activity. And this, of course, raises a huge set of questions about the relationship between these independent economic authorities, fiscal authorities, elected policymakers. It really raises a number of important questions about what are the political consequences of inflation, right? Especially if, the landscape is still evolving, but especially the time. Today there is this recurrent theme and debates about whether central banks can remain independent in this turbulent political economy that characterizes our time. So I really just wanted to pitch, what's the broader framework, the broader debate before entering into, the specific of the book. Sharon was rightly saying that most of the book might read also as economic history. And I completely agree, because to me that was an extremely important aspect of my work. I really wanted to tell how central banks are not stable institutions, but they evolve over time. And so this is, the starting point of my book. The starting point is to show that central banks, the way we think about central banks today, of course, is the outcome of a journey. The early central banks, the ones that were created in the 17th century, first in Sweden, then in the United Kingdom, they were originally created as fiscal agents for governments. They were created to lend to governments, especially, during wars, to manage public debt. They were created as clearing houses to support trade, commerce. They were involved in financial stability in many countries around the world, and especially after the Second World War, also in Europe, they were often closely tied to national development strategies. So central banks also had important development strategies in their mandate. So, central banks have been, not static institutions. They have been extremely evolving institutions over time that have, over time, focused on different goals, that have been mandated to pursue different goals. But if these were, the first central banks, after the 1980s, after the Volcker shock, central banks have evolved and have consolidated into a peculiar institution, okay, whose trade I'm going to discuss with you in a second. But so really the watershed moment, the critical juncture that I think we should all want to keep in mind in our discussion is really what happened with the great inflation that, of course, started already in the 1970s. It built momentum in the 1970s, and then it was conquered when Volcker became, the head of the US Fed. What basically happened is that when Volcker, became the head of the Fed, he basically managed, after a long decade in which inflation was the main problem, not just in the United States, but in many high-income economies. So he really managed to ultimately arrive at the control of inflation. He did that by raising, as I recount in the book, I enter into the detail of that historical moment, how Volcker and the US Fed of the time, they raised rates, with the market's help, they raised rates a lot. And so inflation was finally crashed. Of course, it was finally crashed at the cost of a huge social cost, because of course, when central banks raise interest rates that much, they inevitably lead to a contraction in economic activity, and so in a contraction in employment. And so this is what happened with the Volcker shock. But the Volcker shock was extremely successful in terms of controlling inflation. So inflation was really under a double digit. It was really took down. And from that moment on, the main lessons that were learned from the Volcker experience was that if we want to control inflation, we need to have a central bank that it is independent from the government. Because of course, what Volcker demonstrated was that the previous Fed, the previous chairs of the US Fed were too subservient to political interests. Okay, and so they had been unable to control inflation, because there was, this continuous request from elected policymakers, not to raise interest rates too much because it would have led to lower economic activity. But, Volcker, decidedly decided, okay, we have really to control inflation. So that was the main lesson, that central banks had to be independent from the government. The other thing, is that, the Volcker experience brought home a crucial lesson, that the main goal of the central bank should be that, it should not be too many narrow goals, too many goals, but a very specific goal, the goal of controlling inflation through interest rate policy. And as Sharan was saying before, it was the beginning of inflation targeting. Okay, so it was really popularized the idea that the central bank should control and should target inflation, and so mostly by using interest rate policy. And so basically what happened since the 1980s onwards is that conservativeness became the hallmark of central bank. And by conservativeness, I mean this very narrowly defined attention to controlling inflation. And it really became the global model of central bank, right? As I recount in this book, you could see in the data that show, the diffusion of central bank independence from the 1990s onwards, in the diffusion of inflation targeting around the world. So this is basically what happened. So this is what they call the economic orthodoxy in the book. And economic orthodoxy, as I was saying, is that central banks in many different places, of course, I'm simplifying, but I mean, I think it's a fair description of what happens after, the Volcker shock, is that central banks took, some specific institutional characteristics, and it's a very narrowing down of central banking, especially as compared to the centuries before, the 1980s. And so this narrowing was that, central banks narrowed down their objective on price stability with one tool, the interest rate, and by really resigning their relationship with governments. Okay, the idea, the mantra was that governments should be able to say no to governments and to markets. I added in this slide, this might be more controversial, but the idea was that central banks were technocrats. They should not respond, to any other interest. Okay, and that's the image of central banks as conservative and apolitical institutions that came to dominate in economic circles since at least the 1980s, and especially in the aftermath of the 1990s. And this is the orthodoxy that I discussed in the book, and this is the starting point. So orthodoxy, central banks really became the guardian of orthodoxy. They were also celebrated for this orthodoxy. Think about the United States, after Volcker, and then we had the long era of Alan Greenspan, central banks, came to be seen as the guardians of orthodoxy. They came to be seen as the architects of economic stability. Okay, so they were highly celebrated also for the economic success. Until 2006, we were living in the era of the so-called Great Moderation, in which we had a perfect combination of low inflation and economic growth. Okay, and they're in a very stable global economy. And central banks were widely regarded as one of the crucial actors that contributed to this positive outcome. But then, sorry, I move it one step ahead. So, so they were seen as the guardian of economic orthodoxy. And, so what really interested me is that since 2008, when the global financial crisis started, central banks, although they were really celebrated for having been these guardians of orthodoxy, they started taking a different route. Okay, so they started deviating from inflation targeting. They started deviating from just the narrow goal of maintaining price stability by expanding the list of goals that we're pursuing, from maintaining financial stability, from ensuring financial stability, making sure that the economy could grow. So they started really deviating from the orthodoxy that had characterized the post-1980s and 1990 wars. And so really the question I had is that how the kings of stability, these conservative institutions, became so revolutionaries. So how did they transform central banks? How did they go venturing, experimenting with tools such as quantitative easing, right? That really went against the grain, of what central banks had been doing up to that for a moment. And so, I tried that the book is really about trying to explain these deviations. So how central banks deviated from this orthodoxy in which they had a very narrowly confined view of what central banking is, to a view in which they basically started covering everything, from financial stability to supporting economic activity, to even becoming responsible for climate change. And in the book, I try to make sense of this transformation, and I argue against, a very well-established explanation, because you might have heard of this idea that, central banks were, since after 2008, kind of the only game in town, okay? And, here the argument is that central banks basically were kind of forced to act, and to deviate from just inflation targeting by using, not just interest rates, but using their balance sheet, by using quantitative easing, because they were forced by events. And they were forced because, other economic authorities like fiscal authorities did not have the institutional capacity to act. Another major explanations that try to explain why central banks have evolved, why they have become these unexpected revolutionaries, has to do with ideas and learning. There are many studies that say, what, central banks have learned from the past. The usual example of Bernanke, being Ben Bernanke, now the head of the US Fed, being a scholar of the 1930s. And so he learned the lessons of the 1930s. And so he realized that a too narrowly focused central bank on inflation would not have been able to manage, the financial trouble that started erupting since 2008. And, I say that these explanations, of course, are important, but they also capture just one part of what central bank is. And it is this technocratic view, because, of course, in this characterization, central banks are mainly, independent authorities that acted because they had the institutional independence to act, because they had the ideas, they learned from past experience, and they act. And in the book, I try to make a more political argument. And the argument I try to make in the book is as follows, right? It's if you want, it's a very also straightforward one. Central banks, yes, they are independent, they are technocratic, because most of the time they are staffed by bureaucrats that have, a certain background, a certain educational background. But at the end of the day, they are still political institutions. They operate within domestic political settings. And so even if they are independent, they need a degree of political support to continue operate, especially when they adopt extremely controversial policies, okay, like the ones that have been adopted since 2008 and that have led central banks to really deviate from the post-Volcker experience and the orthodoxy that I was telling you before. Of course, as I was saying, they are peculiar institutions because, of course, they are political like many other institutions, but of course, they are not like, parliaments that seek a vote to be re-elected, right? So the way in which they are political is by constructing an image of a reputation of themselves, which is what allows them to navigate the complex political environment in which they operate. So, central banks, as I argue in the book, they have to appear to be conservative and apolitically, exactly because it's the way in which they retain political support. But, the economy changes. And so when the economic context changes, they have to adapt to these changed circumstances. And so they have to adapt their reputation. And so this is exactly what happened after 2008. And so in the book, what I try to show in the empirical part of the book was that central banks deviated. They expanded from inflation control to financial stability control to using not just interest rate but balance sheet policies only under specific circumstances. And the specific circumstances was that they deviated from orthodoxy when political support was in place. And as I'm going to show you in a second what I mean by political support, when they had the fiscal authorities on their side. Okay, so when, the US Congress, when fiscal authorities in Europe, was supporting central banks, or alternatively, they acted when support was waning. When, there was a huge contestation and societal contestation from central banks, at least in the United States and Europe. And I show how this contestation was consequential. So central banks could not just stand still, they had to react to this societal contestation. So how I advance this argument, as I was saying, the book is done in two parts. This first part is more general. It's this economic history of central banking that, tell how central banks have evolved over time. And then I arrive at the Volcker shock and I explain the rise of orthodoxy. I also tell the story of Japan, which is an interesting case study because Japan is one of the country, a high-income country that had experimented before all the others with quantitative easing. And then, I move on into more specific detailed case studies about the Fed and the ECB in 2008 and 2020. And what I do more in particular, as I show here, I look at very controversial decisions that these two central banks adopted in response to the two crises. And I look at their intervention to maintain financial stability. I look at how they implemented quantitative easing, and I look at how they revised their monetary strategies. And in all these cases, what I try to show is that, the way in which the two central banks intervened was not automatic. Now we take it for granted that they did quantitative easing. Now we take it for granted that the US Fed, intervened to rescue many financial institutions in the United States. But, these decisions cannot be taken for granted because they were the result of the political interaction between the central bank and the fiscal authorities. Okay, let me give you the example that also Sharan was hinting at in his introduction. In the case of the US Fed, we know that when, the global financial crisis started, the Fed intervened, to rescue Bear Stearns and many other financial institutions. But it then let Lehman Brothers go. Okay, and what I show in the book is that, that the conventional wisdom is that, the Fed let Lehman Brothers go because it was not in its legal mandate. It did not have the legal instruments to intervene. But at the end of the day, the truth is that for Lehman, there was no political support. And the political support for the most of financial assistance that the Fed provided came after the Lehman collapse, because as I discuss in the book, Lehman collapse changed politics in Washington. It really moved, Congress and fiscal authorities behind the Fed, when it was clear the financial disasters that could have happened. And that's the reason why after the Lehman collapse, the Fed could intervene to rescue AIG. The same goes for the quantitative easing, as I discussed for both the Fed and the ECB. Even the Fed is usually considered, the most assertive central bank, and in its adoption of quantitative easing, it also adopted, in steps, because they wanted to see the reaction among, the political principals, and elected policymakers. And so that's the reason why I say that, these banks transformed, they deviated from orthodoxy, they took on new tasks, they used quantitative easing, but the way they did it could not be taken for granted, because it was the result of this complicated relationship between the technocratic agent and the fiscal policymakers. Lastly, as I was saying, for both central banks, I analyzed the review of their monetary strategies, because interestingly, both the Fed and the ECB adopted a review of their monetary strategies in 2020 and 2021, respectively. And what I found it fascinating is that the US Fed revises monetary strategy by deviating from a pure inflation targeting type of central bank by adopting the goal of broad-based and inclusive employment. So it basically kind of put much more emphasis on the importance to include employment as the main. Now, the Fed has always had the two mission, right? It's inflation and employment, but now they kind of rebalanced through this review of monetary strategy. And at the same time, the ECB reviewed its monetary strategy by introducing climate change, in the goal that the central bank had to pursue. And what I try to show in the book, again, that this evolution in the way the two central banks conceived their task and their mission was not automatic. But the two central banks, if you want, they both went social because they felt the pressure from public opinion, because of public opinion data clearly show that public support for the two central banks was waning in the two central banks. And so that was the reaction to this declining societal support. So let me summarize, the main takeaway and findings of the book. The finding number one, I think, and one of the main message is that central banks cannot do it alone. As I was saying, what my historical analysis of the two crises shows that and is contrary to the view that central banks were the only game in town, that central banks did not act alone. They acted only when they had the feeling, at least the perception, that they had the government and the fiscal authorities on their side. So, they acted, they put fixes here and there, but, they were the more assertive when they had the feeling. They could deviate much more assertively from orthodoxy when they had the government by their side. Absent coordination, suboptimal outcome, as was the case with the Lehman Brothers case, that really pushed the financial system on the brink of collapse. So I think what is interesting to note is that coordination between central banks and fiscal authorities was important. It did not destroy independence. It did not destroy central banks' independence. And so, this is an open question, but probably, this coordination can be used, in other policy areas. Think about now the challenge of decarbonizing our economies. So probably there is the need for more coordination between monetary and fiscal authorities. A caveat here, of course, the way in which the governments provided support to central banks was extremely different in the two countries I analyzed, because in the United States, the support of the fiscal authorities was clear and visible. It was really burden sharing, Sorry, probably you lost me for a second. Okay. So as I was saying, coordination, was very different on the two sides of the Atlantic, because in the United States, it was, more burden sharing, whereas in Europe was more a division of responsibility, whereby division of responsibility was that the ECB decided to intervene, but, especially in 2008, fiscal authorities enacted austerity. The other takeaway from the book is that central banks listen to a very wide variety of audiences. Okay, now you might know that, especially in political economy, there is this idea that central banks mostly listen to financial markets because that's the way by lowering and basically central banks send a signal that works through financial markets. So, the idea is that exactly for these reasons, central banks basically pay particular attention to financial markets. But what I try to show in the book is that this does not necessarily mean that central banks are democratic, but, they have to listen also, to what, the public and citizens think. Lastly, I think that another major takeaway from the book is, this relationship between inflation, deflation, because of course, the other thing that I didn't mention thus far, but 2008, 2020 were period in which deflation, was the main problem. But, there are important, political consequences that derive from monetary phenomenon, right? Whether there are inflation or deflationary outcomes, because of course the interventions, the deviation from orthodoxy that I was telling you, the fact that central banks deviated from just inflation control to maintaining financial stability and using their balance sheet policy had, of course, enormous consequences in terms of distribution of wealth in the countries, because quantitative easing, disproportionately benefited asset holders, right? So there are huge inequality consequences that need to be kept in mind, and that, of course, ultimately have important consequences for elections. This is also clear if we look at the elections in the United States in November 2024, when the high level of inflation in the United States, of course, has played into the hands of the Trump campaign and Trump election. Now, fast forward. So basically, as I was saying, I told you the story of how central banks transform from being extremely conservative, mostly obsessed only with inflation, with institutions with a much broader mandate that spanned from financial stability to the fight against climate change. And then the real question is that now we are going back to normal in a sense, especially after, the pandemic, the return of inflation, and, with the return of inflation in 2021, 2022, there have been a lot of discussion on whether, and the global rise in interest rates that have taken place, there has been a huge discussion about whether, we are going back to normal, to the kind of the Volcker world I was discussing. My personal position is that it's going to be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle because, of course, the fact that central banks are responsible for financial stability, for instance, has become extremely ingrained, in most central banks around the world. The fact that central banks might be involved in the fight of climate change, it is much more controversial, but again, it's one of those issues that are not going to disappear anytime soon. And lastly, in thinking about whether we are looking into a new transformation of central bank, of course, the United States are going to be, the crucial place to look at, like it was when the Volcker came to the head of the Fed in the 1980s. Because of course, nowadays all eyes on the US Fed, on its fight with Donald Trump, exactly for these reasons, because it's challenging once again the orthodoxy of an independent central bank, right? And it's meddling with its decision. Because of course, the tariff war has put, the Fed in a very complicated position. It has to cut interest rates and risk inflation. It has to resist cuts, but, flirting with market panic. What's at stake here is really the credibility and the threats to independence of central bank. And then, of course, there is the whole discussion about the global role of the dollar that, if we want, of course, we can discuss in our discussion. And so lastly, before leaving the floor for debate, so what we know, right, at the end of this presentation and, based on the findings I tried to share with you. I think that the main message I wanted to convey was that, central banks are political institutions, they are technocratic institutions because they are independent, because they take decision, of course, on the best macroeconomic knowledge available out there. But we should not forget that they are political, right? And so it is absolutely important to study this interaction with the other political authorities and especially with fiscal authority and their evolution, how they deviated from the Volcker image type of central banks to these much more, widespread central banks that take on different goals, which, poses risks to independence, has been the result of the continuous struggle for political support and societal support. And so I think that understanding this peculiar nature of central banks can help us explain both past transformation, but also read the current tensions that are emerging across several quarters, and not least in the United States. And so thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor. If anybody wants to ask or put it in the chat box and I'll read the question, whatever you prefer. And then, Professor, I had a quick question for you. In your book, you
Sure.
have covered deflationary phase 2, and you are right. It seems the central bank do not have the deflationary pressure or a deflationary trend. As you know, many central banks, and not all, of course, 6 central banks went into the negative interest rate zone. So that part is very clear that on the deflationary path, our tools are blunted. At least that's what we feel. The interest rate tool doesn't work there. The other issue is that now, given the tariff war, I know in 2024, but we do know that when Trump came in his earlier, at that point of time, he had raised the issue of the tariffs, and now, of course, he has taken it at the full level. Given the tariff wall that he's creating, what is your analysis? Would the same tools, the Walker rule or the Walker tool or the interest rate tool, work? Or would the central banks have to again and think, as they did during Lehman Brothers? They used the unconventional monetary policy because that is what was required to save the situation. Going the way the things are going, do you think something like that would be required? Because nobody knows how the tariffs are going to feed into the price level. So it's on the global value chain and the supply side stories that we had after COVID, one can understand. But now the circumstances are taking a very different shape. So if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. These are two wonderful questions and two very crucial and important questions. On the deflationary part, absolutely. I mean, that was, what really also intrigued me when I started writing the book, because of course, what happened in 2008 was for the first time in several decades, many economies around the world were grappling with deflation rather than inflationary problem. And so to me, I mean, what was really interesting, and it is led to the revolution part, right, was that, you know, dealing with deflation is problematic. You know, even inflation is problematic for central banks, but deflation is problematic exactly because of the way the fight to inflation has been constructed around the interest rate policy tool. Because of course, I mean, there is a limit to how much you can lower interest rates. And, you know, you can lower interest rates until it hits the zero lower bound. You know, and that was really important. You know, that's what ultimately, you know, led to this revolution, because they really, central banks made a jump into the unknown, right? So that's the reason why I say it was not been automatic, because for conservative institution to take a jump into the unknown, you know, and try to experiment with policies at the zero lower bound, you know, to use innovative tools like quantitative easing, for which there were no data, no long time series data when, you know, they started experimenting with it, was really taking a jump into the unknown. So that's absolutely, you know, the interesting part of the story, right? So that, you know, they had to make sense with this new reality. And that's why I was saying that the experience of Japan, which I recount next to Volcker, is extremely important, because Japan was a very interesting case, you know, in which, you know, the world, you know, was lecturing Japan that they were making monetary policy mistakes since the 1990s. But then, you know, all the others found themselves in similar position to Japan. So that's absolutely important. Moving to the tariff question, which is absolutely central, and I think it's the question of our time. As you were saying, you know, the big question now is that we still do not know how exactly, you know, tariff will feed in our economies. You know, I live in Europe, and, you know, this is the number one policy concern, right? Every day, you know, we have a new study that tries to understand exactly, you know, how much impactful, you know, the tariff will be on different countries and in what sector. So there is a level of unpredictability and uncertainty that makes it extremely difficult for central banks to cope with it. On top of that, to add to the unpredictability, we know that President Trump continues with his announcement, right? And last week, you know, he made another wave of announcement on pharmaceutical material. For instance, in Europe, it was not clear whether it applied to Europe or not. So it was extremely complicated. For central banks, I think that to get at your question, at the moment, the debate is still very much in the Volcker world, if you want, more than the innovative side. And I think rightly so, because of course, tariffs are a negative supply shock, right? So, you know, so really for central banks, the question is still in the Volcker type of world, in which they have to decide how much to lower interest rates, how much they fine-tune interest rates, or we are in that world. But I mean, I think that it will very much depend on how, you know, the impact of tariff will translate in the real economy.
Professor, there are two questions for you in the chat
Sure.
box, and a hand has been raised by one. I can invite them. The two, yeah. Jyoti Kumar, you have a hand raised. NVR Jyoti
Yes, sir.
Kumar, you want to
Yes.
ask your question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Ma'am, very interesting presentation, and I'm tempted to place an order for this book soon after this session is over. I should read this book, and I would
It's a
recommend this
fantastic
book.
book.
Yes,
Fantastic.
yes, yes.
You should read it.
Yeah, I should read it, and I will also recommend for my scholars. I belong to Mizoram University. It is located in Northeast India, and sometime back, Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, he said that if the US had a central bank chief like Y.V. Reddy, at that time Y.V. Reddy was Reserve Bank of India governor, it might have avoided the financial crisis. So this idea actually, I mean, Y.V. Reddy was known for his witty remarks and used to say that the banking should do its boring job, because, you know, I mean, this idea supports the notion that a boring central bank focused on core functions is better for economic stability, right? So, do you think that the present day central banks have been doing some sort of heroic banking in contrast to boring banking? And another question from my side is, no, so banks actually, they are not just for profit organization. Profit is important, but that is not the only objective of a banking system. And they are expected to play social role. And we all know this is a highly unequal world, and this world has become highly violent these days for different reasons. Then what do you think of the role of central banks in order to make this world more inclusive, more humane, more social, rather than more heroic? That is my question.
Thank you so much. Can I reply, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Have questions
Again,
in the box, and Jyoti Kumar has
okay.
asked, so I leave it to you.
Okay, so I start with these ones, and then I take the one in the chat. Thank you. I mean, these are wonderful questions. Okay, let me start with the first part. Of course, you were putting your finger on the question of financial stability, right? And now, central banks have, become also responsible for financial stability. And as I was saying, in the introduction, I mean, the early central banks, when central banks were created, the first central banks, financial instability, fighting financial instability was in their mandate. Then, after the Volcker Revolution, with the narrowing down on inflation targeting, that had kind of being marginalized, more or less. Of course, central banks, they have always been responsible for lender of last resort activities, stuff like that. But, it was inflation targeting, the inflation control that took center stage. So this also ties in with the question before on tariff, because of course, in talking about the unpredictability, that the unpredictability of tariff can also play by undermining financial sectors, right? And so, this is another area where central banks have to be alarmed, and they are already rightly alarmed because they have to, of course, navigate this complex environment. On to the second question, which is extremely important and complicated. Of course, central banks have taken, more social roles. They've taken multiple mandates. This is extremely, this can be addressed in very different ways, in the sense that, on the one hand, is it possible to say that if the central banks take on too many goals, this creates problem also in terms of accountability. Why should we want central banks, that are unelected, to be responsible for, important social goals, okay? On the other hand, I think that, the argument is that, for instance, it is the argument that is done on climate change, is that we are facing such an existential crisis that, we need kind of all hands on deck. And so even, central banks should be recruited and enrolled in this fight. This is a very complicated debate. My personal position is that, let me use the example of climate change. I think that if the responsibility should lie with elected officials. And what I mean by that is that if elected officials, parliaments, think that central banks should be responsible for climate change, they should be the one that give the mandate to central bank, because, governments, legislatures can change, the legislation of central banks. But, allowing central banks to expand their mandate in a revolution similar to the one that I describe in my book can be problematic, because these kind of revolutions then are seen as taking place without, the kind of political accountability that is needed. Right, and so that's my position, that it's up to elected officials to instruct central banks where to go. I think there is another hand that has been raised, right?
Yeah.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
Hi, I wish and I hope I'm audible. Thank
You
you for
are.
the brilliant presentation. The thing that has I mean I came across and was quite an interesting idea, and I wanted to know your thoughts on it. Is that in uncertain environments and multiplying, let's say, mandates, you require more coordination across different ministries in any government. So it is the Ministry of Finance that becomes more important and takes the mandate away in some sense from the central banks. Uh, do you see the role of Ministry of Finance increasing and then taking it away in some sense, the multiplying or even the existing uh, mandates that are with the central banks across the world? Because if you have to do a lot of coordinating work, then you need people who can be, see, everything is technocratic, right? We cannot just say the central bank is technocratic. uh, if you have a COVID coming up, you are not going to ask the politician who is sitting in the chair, but you are going to ask an epidemiologist. So in a way we are living in a technocratic society, but if the political entanglement is required to execute on the mandates that are existing, then it just might make sense. And I read it somewhere, so it just came up to my mind, so I'm asking what's on your thought on that.
Thank you. This is a wonderful question. I mean, my straightforward reaction is that in times of uncertainty, you need economic coordination. Full stop, right? I mean, and it's not that, fiscal authorities are more important than monetary authorities or vice versa. In periods of global economic uncertainty, economic coordination is extremely important. I understand the argument for fiscal authorities, but then there are also strong arguments to make about the coordination among monetary authorities. I mean, this morning I was reading the Financial Times. There was this huge discussion. Okay, what happens? Should the Trump administration direct the U.S. Fed not to use swap lines to provide dollar liquidity to the world, right? So, and in this case, the cooperation, the coordination among monetary authorities is going to be extremely important, right? So my reaction would be that in uncertain time, you need economic coordination. That would certainly help smooth, the difficulties of the period, and both monetary and fiscal authorities are extremely important in this respect.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So there are two questions in the chat box. Would you like to have them?
Yes, as you prefer. So should I start with the last one? It says, without a strong fiscal policy action from the side of government, the monetary action will become tightened. Do you see this? Recently, the Trumpian tariff can negatively impacted more developing economies. At the time, the monetary policy action of central banks tightened. Okay, so basically, if I get the question is that without a strong fiscal policy action from the side of the government, the monetary policy action will, of course, I mean, if this is part of our macroeconomic coordination take place, right? So, when the central bank tighten, it is meant to induce a contractionary outcome, right? This is how it's going to play out. Here, the question is more about the Trumpian tariff and how they will work out, right? So again, it will depend on the domestic monetary response. Here the question was on developing economies, but I mean, I can tell you that it's the same also in high-income countries like the European Union, where we have this discussion on how the ECB should react, to the tariff and to the fluctuation in the dollar value with the dollar, right? Because of course the question is, should then the ECB shadow what the US Fed is gonna do, and try to mind the gap in the interest rate differential. So I think these questions are all important, right, in all jurisdictions. So that's basically how it will play out. Then the other question is this question about to what extent do international economic negotiations in the current geopolitical crisis reflect technical problem solving rather than underlying power politics? Again, this is a very interesting question, and I think it's a question that would really deserve much more attention, which is also related to the previous question that was raised from the audience about the coordination, right? I think that, as I was saying, this is a moment in which the international coordination has been called into question, right? And so really the big question is, think about, the problems with the WTO, right? And, how it has been called into question. So probably nowadays, and, the data seems suggesting it, we are moving into this more fragmented world, right? In which, there are areas, different regions that keep on keeping the dialogue alive. I think this is also an area in which there are opportunities, for economic cooperation and to deepen economic cooperation, probably even without the United States. I think this is something that many parts of the world are actively trying to work on at the moment. But of course, I mean, in any economic negotiation, I think it's impossible to really separate. It's never just a technocratic debate. There is always power politics at play because, of course, the governments sit around the table, they bring in domestic economic interest. So it's not just, technocratic exchanges that take place. But at the same time, the current economic situation really requires that these international economic negotiations take place and survive. There is another question, probably.
How the conflicting goals in growth and inflation control? That's a perennial question, right? From Kripana Prakasham, I think that trade-off is a real trade-off.
It's always
very difficult to, yeah. I think with that, we have exceeded our time limit by about 6 minutes. I know Professor must be very busy. We are on a Friday evening, and Friday evenings joining again is a challenge for many of us.
Of course.
Ahead, we are on a holiday season. We have just a very fantastic festival yesterday, and the holiday season is up. So thank you for coming and talking to us about a very interesting book. I want to thank for having the discussion today. At the end of today's presentation, our website tomorrow by noon. You're welcome to use it, listen it, share it with friends. I'm sure it is going to have some added value too. In our country, it is very valuable because we are working on evaluating inflation targeting. So this book is very rich. Chapter after chapter, that issue keeps coming up. So will be available. We have Unmade Gill speaking to us from the World Bank. He is the chief economist there, and he'll be talking to us. We'll have a little change in time because he's speaking to us from Washington. So we'll change the time to 6. I would request you to kindly watch for the flyer that we'll send to you. Look forward to meeting you again next week. Have a great week. And once again, Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you. It was a lovely conversation. Thank you again.
Thank
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.